Before he ever sat in the Oval Office, before he steered America out of the Great Depression, before he led a fractured world through the storms of World War II, Franklin Delano Roosevelt understood one truth better than most. History does not end with the man who makes it. It echoes, reverberates, reshapes itself through the generations forced to live in its shadow. FDR built a presidency larger than life, a four-term colossus whose decisions redrew the modern world, and yet the most overlooked legacy he left behind was not written in legislation or victory speeches. It lived in the 23 grandchildren who inherited his name, his contradictions, his charm, his burdens, and the impossible expectation to measure up to a titan. Some embraced the weight, some ran from it, some fell under it, and a few quietly rewrote the Roosevelt story in ways the public never saw coming. This is the hidden saga of FDR's 23 grandchildren, a dynasty born in the glow of Hyde Park and the White House, raised under the shadows of power, and shaped by a history too immense for any one family to escape. Franklin Delano Roosevelt reshaped the American presidency so profoundly that every generation since has lived in the political architecture he built. He led the nation through economic collapse, global war, and ideological upheaval. But behind the speeches, behind the parades, behind the fireside chats that steadied a trembling nation, was a family undergoing its own quiet transformation. His 5 surviving children, Anna, James, Elliot, Franklin Jr., and John, each carried the Roosevelt banner into the mid-20th century. And from them came 23 grandchildren, born into a dynasty already intertwined with myth. These grandchildren entered a world where their last name opened doors while quietly closing others. They were raised with the expectation of greatness, or, at the very least, public responsibility. Their childhoods unfolded in mansions, townhomes, diplomatic residences, and summer estates, environments where political conversation was as common as religion in other households. Some were groomed for public life. Others rebelled against it. Many grew up navigating the complicated, emotional aftermath of being part of America's most visible political family since the Adamses. The Roosevelt legacy gave them access, fame, and opportunity. It also demanded sacrifice, scrutiny, and the constant negotiation of identity. Their lives unfolded against the explosive backdrop of post-war America, a nation shifting from global victory to Cold War tension, from the optimism of the 1950s to the upheaval of the 1960s, from the rise of television politics to the decline of old-world dynasties. As the world modernized, the Roosevelt grandchildren were forced to decide whether to follow the path laid out before them or to carve their own futures beyond the gravitational pull of Hyde Park. Some entered politics, some entered business, some built careers in the arts or philanthropy. Some lived quietly, slipping away from public view to protect their privacy. And some faced tragedies that echoed through the Roosevelt line with haunting familiarity reminders that even the most historic families are not spared the vulnerabilities of ordinary life. To understand FDR's grandchildren is to understand how a legend transforms across generations, how power evolves, how families fracture, how history moves from national myth to intimate reality, and how a name can be both a crown and a burden. Now, from this foundation, we move toward the world that shaped them, the Roosevelt household, the expectations within it, and the legacy they were born to inherit. The Roosevelt family did not simply live history, they inhabited it. Hyde Park was more than a home. It was a stage on which some of the 20th century's defining moments were quietly rehearsed, long before they were broadcast to the nation. FDR's children grew up with Secret Service agents in the hallways, foreign dignitaries at the dinner table, and the sound of their father's voice projected into millions of American homes. Yet beneath the polished image of the Roosevelt dynasty lay fractures, pressures, and emotional currents that shaped the environment into which the grandchildren were born. The Roosevelt household was large, complicated, and marked by generational contrasts. Sarah Delano Roosevelt, FDR's formidable mother, set the tone for the family's internal world. Her influence was absolute during FDR's childhood and remained powerful well into his adulthood. Her expectations for decorum, ambition, and family loyalty would echo across 2 generations. Eleanor Roosevelt, by contrast, transformed the role of First Lady into a platform for activism, human rights, and public engagement. Her relentless schedule, her independence, and her emotional distance with FDR created a family dynamic unlike any in American political history. FDR's children grew up under these 2 opposing forces. Sarah's authority and Eleanor's idealism and their own marriages reflected the strain. Most of them divorced more than once. Some struggled with substance use, others with identity, others with the weight of public scrutiny. And into these turbulent lives came the 23 grandchildren, born from 1927 to 1966, arriving in a political dynasty at its peak, but raised in a family still wrestling with the consequences of power. The expectations placed on these grandchildren were enormous. Their grandfather had saved democracy. Their grandmother had redefined global humanitarianism. Their surname Roosevelt was not simply a family name, it was a national symbol. Yet what they inherited was not only influence, but complexity. Fractured parent-child relationships, unresolved trauma from growing up in a political spotlight, and the restless pursuit of purpose that often haunts the descendants of giants. The grandchildren grew up across different worlds, some in Washington's diplomatic circles, some in Hyde Park's quiet acreage, others in California, New York, London, or the American Midwest. Their lives spanned the post-war boom, the Cold War, the counterculture movement, and the beginning of the modern era of media scrutiny. Some embraced the Roosevelt name as a mission. Others fled from it to seek anonymity. Some achieved public distinction. Others lived lives marked by complication or tragedy. To understand the arc of these 23 lives, we start with the line of the eldest Roosevelt child, Anna Eleanor Roosevelt, FDR's only daughter, whose own complicated relationship with her parents shaped the first branch of the next generation. The first grandchild born into the Roosevelt dynasty was Anna Eleanor Roosevelt, Sisti Doll, whose story captures the first echoes of a family still adjusting to fame, power, and the burden of expectation. From the outside, the Roosevelt grandchildren were born into a dynasty overflowing with glamour and influence. But from the inside, their world was more complex, shaped by parental absences, political tension, fractured marriages, and the lingering emotional turbulence of a family that had grown accustomed to sacrificing personal needs for public duty. Each grandchild, arriving into a different moment of the Roosevelt saga, inherited a different version of the same legacy. The expectation to define themselves in relation to a grandfather whose leadership altered the course of the world. Anna Roosevelt's children were the first to navigate this landscape. They were raised in the crucible of the White House, watched the Second World War from its inner chambers, and grew up with a grandmother whose humanitarian mission often took precedence over family life. They became the earliest test of what it meant to inherit greatness, not in monuments or medals, but in daily life, where the Roosevelt name was both shield and spotlight. And so, our journey begins with the firstborn of the Roosevelt grandchildren, a girl who entered the White House not as a visitor, not as a symbol, but as a child trying to understand why the world watched her family so closely. Her story marks the opening chapter of a generational odyssey unlike any other in American history. Number 23. Anna Eleanor Sisti Doll, the first grandchild, raised in the center of power. Anna Eleanor Sisti Doll, born in 1927, came into the world as the very first grandchild of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, a child whose earliest memories would be etched not in quiet nurseries or family gardens, but in the echoing marble corridors of the White House. She was born to Anna Roosevelt, FDR's only daughter, whose own complicated relationship with her mother Eleanor shaped the emotional landscape into which Sisti arrived. From infancy, Sisti lived in 2 parallel worlds. In one, she was simply a child adored by her grandparents, especially Eleanor, who poured into her the affection she struggled to express with her own children. In the other, she was a symbol, the first of the next generation of Roosevelts. The continuation of a dynasty millions of Americans watched with fascination. Her name appeared in newspapers before she could walk. Her first steps were taken under the gaze of Secret Service agents. Her earliest toys shared shelf space with diplomatic gifts from world leaders. When FDR entered the White House in 1933, Sisty and her younger brother Buzzy moved into Washington as part of the Roosevelt household. There, despite her youth, Sisty witnessed the unfolding of history from a vantage point no other American child could claim. She saw the long lines of desperate citizens coming to see her grandfather. She heard the muffled tones of urgent conversations behind closed doors. She watched her grandmother transform the role of First Lady into something new, something public, powerful, relentless. Sisty quickly learned that in the Roosevelt family, childhood was never entirely private. During FDR's presidency, the media adored her. She appeared in photographs with her grandfather, rode ponies on the White House lawn, attended holiday events, and became, for many Americans, the symbolic child of the New Deal era and the smiling granddaughter of the man who promised hope to a broken nation. Yet, as she grew older, Sisty sensed the emotional fault lines beneath the surface. Her mother, Anna, often struggled with the dual expectations of being both a public figure and a young woman longing for autonomy. Eleanor, beloved by the nation, but emotionally distant at home, created a dynamic that oscillated between admiration and strain. Sisty, perceptive and sensitive, absorbed all of it. Her adolescence was shaped by the Second World War. She watched soldiers visit the White House, saw her grandfather age under the weight of global conflict, and endured the sudden tragedies that came with wartime uncertainty. In 1945, when FDR died in Warm Springs, Sisty, then only 18, witnessed firsthand the collapse of the world that had defined her childhood. The White House emptied. The Roosevelt presence in Washington dimmed. And the family, long accustomed to public purpose, found itself navigating private grief. After the war, Sisty began forging a life outside politics. She attended college, married, raised children, and gradually stepped away from the intense public scrutiny that had defined her youth. For decades, she lived quietly, choosing a path that prioritized personal stability over public visibility, a sharp departure from the dynastic expectations into which she had been born. Yet the Roosevelt legacy never disappeared from her life. She became an informal steward of family memory, preserving stories, letters, and impressions of a childhood unlike any other. Her reflections have become essential for historians seeking to understand the human dimension of the Roosevelt White House, the daily rhythms, the emotional struggles, the small moments that never made headlines. Among the 23 Roosevelt grandchildren, Sisty Dahl stands as the one who saw it all first, the one who absorbed the extraordinary world of her grandparents with the eyes of a child, the one who lived through the final decade of FDR's presidency from the inside out, the one who learned early that history is not merely written in books or speeches, but in the quiet, unguarded moments between family members living under its crushing weight. Number 22. Curtis Roosevelt. Buzzy Dahl, the grandson who grew up in a palace and spent a lifetime escaping it. Curtis Roosevelt, Dahl known to the world simply as Buzzy, was born in 1930. The second child of Anna Roosevelt and the grandson who would become the most self-aware chronicler of the Roosevelt dynasty. If his sister Sisty experienced the White House as a home, Buzzy experienced it as a stage one he did not choose, but could never entirely walk away from. By the time Buzzy was 3 years old, his grandfather was President of the United States. His first memories were not of playgrounds or schoolyards, but of Marine Guards, diplomatic receptions, and the constant hum of a country clawing its way out of despair. Reporters adored him. Photographers followed him. Americans saw in the little boy a symbol of renewal, a reminder that even in crisis, life continued. But inside the Roosevelt family, things were far more complicated. His parents' marriage was already strained. His grandmother, Eleanor, was beloved by the nation, but carried a distance, emotional, psychological, that her grandchildren felt acutely. His grandfather, though warm in private, was consumed by the responsibilities of leadership. And his mother, Anna, caught between loyalty to her parents and the frustrations of her marriage, leaned heavily on the White House as both refuge and trap. For Buzzy, childhood privacy was a fantasy. Every birthday was reported in the press, every expression captured by cameras, every innocent comment held potential political implications. The world wanted him to be a Roosevelt before he even understood what the name meant. As he grew older, he sensed the emotional fractures within the family, fractures the public never saw. He watched his parents' marriage fail. He witnessed tensions between Anna and Eleanor that ran like hidden currents through the household. He overheard the whispered conversations about his mother's role in his grandfather's final months. And when FDR died in 1945, Buzzy, at 14, suddenly found himself expelled from the world that had shaped him. The White House doors closed. The Roosevelt name no longer guaranteed purpose. The boy who had been raised inside history now had to learn how to live outside it. Adolescence brought turmoil, multiple schools, shifting parental homes, a struggle to define himself separate from the dynasty that had both elevated and suffocated him. But Buzzy possessed something rare among the Roosevelt grandchildren: clarity. He understood the difference between public myth and private truth, and he was determined to confront both. As an adult, he built a career far from Washington. He worked in public relations, then joined the United Nations as an administrator, focusing on global development rather than domestic politics. He lived abroad, married multiple times, and gradually carved out an identity that belonged to him, not to FDR. But his greatest contribution came later in life, when he became a writer and public commentator. Unlike most political heirs, Buzzy refused to sanitize his family's history. His memoirs, most famously Too Close to the Sun, revealed the emotional complexities of growing up a Roosevelt, the pressure, the privilege, the wounds, and the profound loneliness that came with being America's first grandson. He exposed the family's internal tensions not out of cruelty, but out of a belief that truth mattered more than mythology. In doing so, he forced the world to see FDR not simply as a giant, but as a human being, and the Roosevelt family not as an American fairy tale, but as a fractured, resilient, deeply complicated clan. Curtis Roosevelt died in 2016 at age 86, the longest-lived of FDR's grandchildren. His life stands as a counterpoint to the legend that shaped him. He was the grandson who refused to be defined by history. The boy raised in the world's most famous house, the man who spent decades learning how to walk out of it, and the chronicler who left behind the emotional truth of a dynasty most Americans only thought they understood. Number 21. Eleanor Roosevelt Seagraves, the granddaughter who became the memory keeper. Eleanor Roosevelt Seagraves, born in 1932, arrived into the Roosevelt world at a moment when the family's public power and private instability were both reaching their peak. Named after the most famous woman in America, she was the third and youngest child of Anna Roosevelt, and the grandchild who would ultimately become the quiet custodian of the Roosevelt legacy. Not through politics or public spectacle, but through preservation, scholarship, and the protection of memory. From the beginning, Eleanor Seagraves lived under the weight of her grandmother's name, but unlike the pressure that shaped her brother Buzzy or the spotlight that followed her sister Sisty, Eleanor's childhood unfolded with a quieter, more introspective rhythm. She was the child who watched rather than performed, who listened rather than announced herself, who absorbed the emotional complexity of the Roosevelt household with rare sensitivity. Her young years were split between the solemn grandeur of the White House and the more intimate domestic spaces of Hyde Park and Campobello. She experienced FDR not as the mythologized leader whose voice carried across the nation, but as a grandfather who radiated warmth despite the burdens he carried. She watched Eleanor Roosevelt, the public figure, transform into grandmère, a woman whose love was expressed less through traditional affection and more through guidance, principle, and a relentless push toward purpose. But Eleanor's childhood was also marked by instability. Her mother's turbulent marriages, the constant movement between homes, and the emotional distance between Anna and Eleanor Roosevelt shaped her worldview. She learned early that the Roosevelt family loved fiercely, but not always easily. When FDR died in 1945, Eleanor Seagraves was only 13. Where Buzzy felt the sudden void as exile, she experienced it as a profound shift in responsibility. Without the White House to anchor the family, it fell largely to Eleanor Roosevelt, and later to the younger Eleanor, to maintain the threads of connection between scattered family members. In the years that followed, Eleanor Seagraves gravitated not toward politics, but toward education and archival work. She became a librarian, historian, and scholar, dedicating her life to preserving the Roosevelt story with clarity and integrity. Not the myth, not the sanitized version, the truth. She assisted in the organization of the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum, the first of its kind in the United States. She worked closely with documents, letters, and private papers that revealed the emotional complexities behind public decisions. She became one of the most respected interpreters of Eleanor Roosevelt's life, ensuring that her grandmother's legacy remained grounded in both her public activism and her deeply personal struggles. Unlike some family members who became political figures, business executives, or public commentators, Eleanor Seagraves chose a quieter path, but one that proved essential. She protected the nuance of the Roosevelt legacy. She ensured the archives reflected the full measure of the family's humanity. She became the bridge between scholars and the living Roosevelt memory, guiding historians toward accuracy and depth rather than myth-making. Her life stood in stark contrast to the turbulence that shaped many of FDR's descendants. She embodied steadiness in a family known for brilliance and volatility. She carried responsibility without demanding attention. She preserved history without trying to rewrite it. Among FDR's 23 grandchildren, Eleanor Roosevelt Seagraves stands as the one who held the family's past in her hands. The granddaughter who understood that legacy is not made of marble or myth, but of paper, ink, memory, and truth. Number 20. James Roosevelt Jr., the firstborn of FDR's firstborn son. A life lived in the longest shadow. James Roosevelt Jr., born in 1924, arrived into the world already carrying a name heavy with expectation. He was the first son of James Roosevelt, FDR's eldest child, and the first male grandchild in a dynasty where lineage mattered. Even before he was old enough to speak, family insiders understood one truth. If any Roosevelt grandchild would be drawn toward public life, it would be James Jr. He bore the name, the birth order, and the unspoken pressure of succession. But life inside the Roosevelt family was rarely simple, and James Jr.'s story reveals the emotional cost of being raised in the gravitational pull of political greatness. As a boy, he grew up between Hyde Park, Campobello Island, and the ever-shifting residences of his father. His early years were filled with privilege, tutors, travel, access to powerful figures, but also instability. His father remarried multiple times, his home life fractured and reformed like a kaleidoscope. And looming above everything was his grandfather, the president, a man so consumed by the nation's crises that family often came second to destiny. FDR loved his grandchildren, but his presence was sporadic, filtered through official events, formal gatherings, and the rare private moment. For James Jr., adoration of his grandfather was mixed with longing, the sense of being connected to an extraordinary man, yet also held at a distance by the demands of public life. When World War II erupted, James Jr. was still a teenager. Motivated by duty, expectation, or both, he enlisted in the military and served in the U.S. Marine Corps, following in the footsteps of the Roosevelt tradition of public service. He served honorably in the Pacific Theater, witnessing firsthand the brutality of war, an experience that left emotional imprints far beyond the medals he earned. Yet the war did not offer clarity. It only deepened the question that haunted him. What does it mean to be a Roosevelt without being FDR? After returning home, James Jr. attempted several careers: business, politics, diplomacy. But none gave him the sense of purpose or identity his grandfather had embodied so effortlessly. His father, James Roosevelt Sr., had entered politics and served in Congress, carving out a public role with mixed results. But James Jr. did not have his father's appetite for the political arena, nor his grandfather's singular charisma. He spent years searching, through relationships, through work, through geography, for a life not defined entirely by the Roosevelt name. And slowly, he found it. James Jr. built a career in finance and investment. Far from the press, far from the expectations of Hyde Park, far from the presidency's lingering shadow. He married, raised children, and constructed a private world that the newspapers scarcely touched. He was not a Roosevelt seeking the spotlight. He was a Roosevelt seeking peace. Yet, in adulthood, he also embraced a quieter form of legacy work. He became involved with historical and family institutions, offering insight into the Roosevelt lineage while avoiding the self-promotion common among political heirs. He contributed to organizations dedicated to preserving his grandparents' memory, not as their public defender, but as their realist. Someone who understood that the Roosevelt story was as much about flawed human beings as it was about national triumphs. James Roosevelt Jr. lived a long life, passing away in 1991. He never ran for office. He never attempted to match FDR's achievements. And in refusing to compete with his grandfather's legacy, he achieved something else entirely. He built a life defined by self-understanding rather than expectation. Among FDR's 23 grandchildren, he represents the quiet counterweight to political destiny, the grandson born under the brightest spotlight who chose instead to walk steadily toward the shade. Number 19. Franklin Delano Roosevelt III. The grandson who turned a political legacy into a moral mission. Franklin Delano Roosevelt III, born in 1938, arrived into a family where his very name carried the weight of a nation's memory. To be Franklin Delano Roosevelt, even with a Roman numeral attached, was not simply to inherit a lineage. It was to inherit expectation, myth, and the unfinished conversations of American democracy. But unlike those in his family who tried to enter politics, Franklin III did something quietly revolutionary. He transformed the Roosevelt legacy into a lifetime of intellectual and moral inquiry, not public power. He was the eldest son of Franklin D. Roosevelt Jr., a congressman who carried his father's political instincts and his mother's fierce independence. His childhood moved between privilege and turbulence, between the polished rooms of Hyde Park and the shifting emotional ground of the Roosevelt households, where marriages came apart and politics consumed time, attention, and affection, where some Roosevelt grandchildren responded to this instability with restlessness. Franklin III responded with thought. He was contemplative, curious, drawn early to questions of fairness, inequality, and structural power. Questions that his grandfather had grappled with in practice, but which Franklin III approached through scholarship. He attended Yale University, surrounded by young men destined for power, but he charted a different path. Economics. Not the kind used to justify wealth, but the kind used to question it. He went on to earn a PhD and devoted himself to radical political economy, embracing a left-leaning intellectual stance that challenged the very elites from which he had descended. Where FDR wielded government to stabilize capitalism, Franklin III asked whether capitalism itself was the problem. Where his family embodied political aristocracy, he aligned himself with labor, redistribution, and democratic socialism. Where others capitalized on the Roosevelt name, he used it sparingly, to protect the integrity of his arguments, not to amplify them. His academic career spanned decades at Sarah Lawrence College, where he became a beloved professor known for treating students as collaborators rather than subordinates. His work dissected economic inequality, the power structures behind markets, and the moral failures of unchecked wealth, themes that quietly echoed the New Deal, but with a sharper to be. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, even with a Roman numeral attached, was not simply to inherit a lineage. It was to inherit expectation, myth, and the unfinished conversations of American democracy. But unlike those in his family who tried to enter politics, Franklin III did something quietly revolutionary. He transformed the Roosevelt legacy into a lifetime of intellectual and moral inquiry, not public power. He was the eldest son of Franklin D. Roosevelt, Jr., a congressman who carried his father's political instincts and his mother's fierce independence. His childhood moved between privilege and turbulence, between the polished rooms of Hyde Park and the shifting emotional ground of the Roosevelt households, where marriages came apart and politics consumed time, attention, and affection, where some Roosevelt grandchildren responded to this instability with restlessness. Franklin III responded with thought. He was contemplative, curious, drawn early to questions of fairness, inequality, and structural power. Questions that his grandfather had grappled with in practice, but which Franklin III approached through scholarship. He attended Yale University, surrounded by young men destined for power, but he charted a different path. Economics. Not the kind used to justify wealth, but the kind used to question it. He went on to earn a PhD and devoted himself to radical political economy, embracing a left-leaning intellectual stance that challenged the very elites from which he had descended. Where FDR wielded government to stabilize capitalism, Franklin III asked whether capitalism itself was the problem. Where his family embodied political aristocracy, he aligned himself with labor, redistribution, and democratic socialism. Where others capitalized on the Roosevelt name, he used it sparingly, to protect the integrity of his arguments, not to amplify them. His academic career spanned decades at Sarah Lawrence College, where he became a beloved professor known for treating students as collaborators rather than subordinates. His work dissected economic inequality, the power structures behind markets, and the moral failures of unchecked wealth, themes that quietly echoed the New Deal, but with a sharper, more radical edge. And yet, for all his ideological boldness, Franklin III remained emotionally grounded in family history. He honored his grandfather not through imitation, but through interrogation, asking the questions FDR himself, constrained by wartime realities and political necessity, never fully explored. Outside academia, Franklin III married a woman whose own legacy shaped American debate. Grace Roosevelt, granddaughter of Theodore Roosevelt. Their union symbolized a rare fusion of both Roosevelt lines, Hyde Park and Oyster Bay, once bitterly divided by politics but united, in this generation, by shared values and intellectual pursuit. Franklin III's life was not marked by public office, national spotlight, or political dynasty building. Instead, it became something arguably more enduring: the moral examination of the structures that define American life. He carried forward the Roosevelt legacy not as destiny, but as question, pushing the nation to consider whether FDR's solutions went far enough, whether justice requires something deeper than reform, and whether a more equitable world is possible. Among the 23 Roosevelt grandchildren, Franklin Delano Roosevelt III stands as the intellectual conscience of the family, the heir who refused the throne, choosing instead the long, quiet work of rethinking the society his grandfather helped shape. Number 18. William Bill Roosevelt, the grandson who inherited a name but fought for his own identity. William Bill Roosevelt, born in 1945 to Franklin D. Roosevelt, Jr., and his second wife, Ethel DuPont, entered the world as part of one of America's most powerful unions. The marriage between two dynasties, the Roosevelts and the DuPonts. It should have promised stability, wealth, and prestige. Instead, he grew up in the wreckage of one of the Roosevelt family's most turbulent relationships. Bill's childhood unfolded in the aftermath of a bitter divorce, that cut through the heart of two prominent families. His parents' marriage, strained from the beginning, collapsed publicly and painfully. In that emotional crossfire, Bill became a child tossed between worlds, between political royalty on one side and industrial aristocracy on the other. Family fractures, resentment, and conflicting expectations shaped his earliest years. While some Roosevelt grandchildren grew up in the glare of Washington, Bill experienced something more chaotic. Sudden moves, shifting guardianship dynamics, and the psychological toll of being raised in a family where obligation often overshadowed affection. He was intelligent, perceptive, and imaginative, but he lacked the structure that other Roosevelt children found through schools, mentors, or public duty. Adolescence only magnified the cracks. Bill struggled academically and socially, developing a rebellious streak that his father, a stern, politically driven man, could neither understand nor control. Where Franklin Jr. sought order, discipline, and legacy, Bill sought escape. And escape, tragically, is what he found. By his late teens, Bill had drifted into the fringes of counterculture. Drugs offered relief from pressure, alienation, and emotional complexity he had never been allowed to express. Arrests followed, headlines followed. And suddenly, the Roosevelt name, usually associated with dignity and service, was tied to scandal. His fall from grace became national news, a painful reminder that even the strongest family legacies could shatter under the weight of unresolved trauma. For Bill's father, this was humiliation. For Bill, it was heartbreak. For the Roosevelt family, it was a wound that exposed their long-ignored fractures. Over the decades, Bill struggled with addiction, legal troubles, and long periods of instability. He drifted through phases of recovery and relapse, work and unemployment, marriage and estrangement. And yet, within that chaos, there remained a thread of humanity. A kindness noted by those who knew him well, a gentleness that surfaced when the storms quieted. His life became a study in contrast. The grandson of a four-term president, living in the margins. The heir to two American dynasties, searching for belonging. A man born into extraordinary privilege, undone by emotional wounds no privilege could heal. In later years, Bill managed periods of sobriety and attempted to rebuild fractured relationships. His life never fully stabilized, but it reached moments of peace outside the public eye. Moments of quiet dignity far removed from the headlines that once defined him. When William Bill Roosevelt died in 1986, at only 41, the family mourned privately. His story, seldom discussed, became a haunting reminder that the Roosevelt legacy was not only about greatness, service, and public triumph. It was also about the cost of pressure, the fragility of childhood, and the emotional consequences of living in a dynasty where identity is often predetermined before birth. Among FDR's 23 grandchildren, Bill Roosevelt stands as the most tragic figure. The grandson who inherited the weight of history, but not the support needed to bear it. The man whose struggles reveal the humanity hidden beneath America's most celebrated political family. Number 17. Henry Hall Roosevelt, the grandson who lived between privilege and disappearing footsteps. Henry Hall Roosevelt, born in 1945 to Franklin D. Roosevelt Jr. and Ethel DuPont, entered the world alongside his twin brother Bill. But unlike Bill, whose turbulent life would make national headlines, Hall inhabited the quieter margins of the Roosevelt saga. A child shaped by the same fractured family, the same emotional storms, the same dynastic pressure. Yet determined to carve for himself a life of lower altitude, away from the glare. Hall grew up in a household already buckling under two powerful legacies. His mother came from the DuPont Empire, a dynasty of wealth and industrial influence. His father carried the political expectations of Hyde Park and Washington, where public duty swallowed private responsibility. Their marriage, difficult, volatile, and ultimately doomed, created an atmosphere in which childhood became something to be endured rather than embraced. In this environment, Hall developed the survival instinct of the quiet child, watching, memorizing, slipping between tensions before they erupted. While Bill acted out, Hall retreated inward. He learned early that in the Roosevelt world, visibility was dangerous. Expectations came with scrutiny. Mistakes became public property. And affection, often conditional, was distributed through the prism of achievement. Hall did not rebel. He vanished. Not literally, but emotionally, choosing withdrawal over confrontation, self-containment over drama. He attended the same elite schools expected of a Roosevelt, but unlike his father or grandfather, he showed no interest in public life. Politics held no appeal. Prestige carried no magnetism. And the Roosevelt name, which felt like destiny to some of his cousins, felt to Hall like a label that did not fit. When his parents' marriage imploded, Hall, like Bill, became a child split between two worlds. But while Bill spiraled outward, Hall moved inward, finding solace in invisibility. Family friends later described him as sensitive, intelligent, and gentle. A young man who longed for stability more than status. Adulthood took Hall far from the arenas his grandfather once commanded. While other Roosevelt grandchildren became professors, diplomats, journalists, or public advocates, Hall chose the private road. He lived modestly, worked without fanfare, built relationships outside the Roosevelt orbit, and resisted the gravitational pull of Dynasty. He did not seek interviews. He avoided the Roosevelt spotlight. And unlike many in his family, he never attempted to rewrite or defend the Roosevelt legacy. He simply lived his own life. Yet the emotional consequences of his childhood never fully loosened their grip. Hall struggled with periods of instability, moving in and out of steady employment and maintaining a fragile relationship with the larger Roosevelt family network. Like Bill, he had inherited not only privilege, but trauma. The generational fractures that ripple through dynasties long after newspapers stop printing their names. Hall never courted publicity, and history has left only faint footprints of his adult years. His life did not produce headlines, controversies, or political legacies. Instead, it revealed a quieter truth. Not every descendant of giants becomes a giant. Some simply want to walk outside the shadow. Henry Hall Roosevelt died in 2013, leaving behind no memoirs, no political speeches, no dramatic public arc. But in the broader story of FDR's descendants, his life speaks to something essential, that even in America's most storied families, there are children who survive by shrinking, not rising, by stepping sideways out of history's path, not forward into it. Among the 23 Roosevelt grandchildren, Hall stands as the reminder that legacy is not destiny. It is a weight some carry and others quietly set down, choosing a life not measured by the world's expectations, but by the simple, private search for peace. Number 16. John Aspinwall Roosevelt II, the grandson who broke away from the Roosevelt political DNA. John Aspinwall Roosevelt II, born in 1916, came into the world as the youngest child of Elliott Roosevelt, FDR, and Eleanor's second son. Unlike many of his cousins and siblings who leaned instinctively toward politics, public advocacy, or legacy stewardship, John grew up to become the Roosevelt who turned decisively, almost defiantly, away from the family's political inheritance. If the Roosevelt dynasty produced a long line of activists, reformers, and public servants, John was the anomaly. The Roosevelt who chose business over politics, privacy over publicity, and republicanism in a family whose lifeblood was the Democratic Party. His life began quietly, compared to later Roosevelt grandchildren born into the frenzy of FDR's presidency. His childhood was shaped more by the turbulence of his father Elliott's personal life than by the political theater of Washington. Elliott struggled with relationships, finances, and identity. He married frequently, moved constantly, and rarely offered his children stable ground. John, as his youngest, absorbed the instability early. Where some children respond to chaos with rebellion, John responded with discipline. Where others cling to legacy, he rejected it. Where many Roosevelt grandchildren grew up defined by the expectations of Hyde Park, John deliberately positioned himself outside its orbit. He attended elite schools, of course, Groton, then Harvard. But he carried none of the entitlement often associated with his family name. He was quieter than his siblings, less theatrical than his father, and almost allergic to the idea of being a public Roosevelt. While other Roosevelt children floated toward journalism, diplomacy, or elected office, John leaned toward finance, structure, and autonomy. He married Anne Lindsay Clark, the daughter of industrial wealth, a match based not on political alignment, but shared pragmatism. It was a union that offered stability, something scarce in the Roosevelt lineage, and grounded him in a life well outside the political limelight. But the defining twist in John Aspinwall Roosevelt's life came not from his career, but from his politics. He became a Republican, not a quiet one, not a reluctant one, a vocal, committed, ideologically firm Republican. In a family built on the New Deal, this was stunning, almost heretical. But John did not adopt the identity to provoke. It was, instead, a reflection of his values: fiscal conservatism, institutional order, and skepticism toward charismatic, personality-driven politics. An understandable reaction for a man whose grandfather had embodied it. His political alignment created tension within the Roosevelt clan, particularly with Eleanor, who believed deeply in the Democratic mission. Yet John never wavered. He campaigned for Republican candidates, fundraised for the party, and insisted that being a Roosevelt did not mean surrendering independent thought. His career in finance grew steadily. He became an executive, serving in leadership roles for department store chains and investment firms. He preferred boardrooms to podiums, private negotiation to public persuasion. In the Roosevelt universe, where activism and visibility were almost genetic, John's path was a quiet rebellion. But his life was not without service. He became involved in philanthropy, especially in education and cultural institutions. Unlike his grandfather, he never sought to reshape the nation. Unlike his grandmother, he never sought to reshape global conscience. Instead, he reshaped the Roosevelt narrative, proving that even in dynasties, individuality survives. John Aspinwall Roosevelt died in 1981, leaving behind children, a stable marriage, and a legacy defined not by political triumph or public spectacle, but by principled independence. Among FDR's 23 grandchildren, he is the countercurrent, the grandson who refused the script, the Roosevelt who broke the political pattern, the man who proved that even in America's most storied family, identity is not inherited. It is chosen. Number 15. Haven Roosevelt, the grandson who disappeared from the dynasty's spotlight. Haven Roosevelt, born in 1940, came into a family already heavy with fame, expectation, and emotional entanglements. He was the son of Elliott Roosevelt, FDR and Eleanor's second son, a man whose public accomplishments were often eclipsed by his private turbulence. Elliott married 5 times, moved frequently, and lived in a way that left stability scattered behind him like debris. In that unstable wake, Haven entered the world. But unlike many Roosevelt grandchildren, Haven slipped quickly into the quieter corners of the family narrative. His life was shaped not by the spotlight, not by political ambition, not by dynastic pride, but by an instinct for distance. From the public eye, from the Roosevelt name, and even from the chaotic gravitational pull of his father's emotional orbit. His childhood was mobile, unsettled, and shaped by the complicated relationships surrounding Elliott. The Roosevelt glamour never quite settled on Haven's shoulders. Instead, he grew up watching the adults around him struggle with legacy, identity, and relationship turmoil. He learned early that fame was not always a blessing, that visibility came with scrutiny, and that the Roosevelt name could illuminate, but it could also burn. Where many Roosevelt cousins were groomed for boarding schools, diplomatic circles, or the Beltway's social machinery, Haven's life took a different shape. He gravitated toward privacy, toward environments where the Roosevelt legacy held little relevance. Those close to him described a gentle, intelligent young man who did not crave attention, a striking contrast to his father Eliot, whose life was often driven by the pursuit of recognition. Eliot's expectations for his children were inconsistent, shaped by his own restlessness. He pushed some toward public life, pressured others to live out the unfinished chapters of his own ambitions. But Haven resisted the gravitational force of paternal expectation. He refused to perform. He refused to posture. He refused to become another Roosevelt consumed by the relentless echo of an illustrious name. As a young adult, Haven stepped away from the Roosevelt world almost entirely. He did not enter politics. He did not join the military. He did not write memoirs or participate in family publicity. Instead, he carved out a life grounded in personal autonomy, one that unfolded quietly, without the fanfare that had defined 2 generations before him. The details of Haven Roosevelt's adulthood remain sparse, not because he lacked significance, but because he chose obscurity in a family that almost never had that luxury. He worked, built relationships, and constructed an identity separate from Hyde Park and Washington. And in doing so, he became a subtle but profound counterpoint to the Roosevelt mythology. He revealed a truth that is often overlooked in political dynasties. Sometimes the bravest act is not stepping into the spotlight. Sometimes it is walking away from it. Haven Roosevelt died young, in 1962, at just 22 years old. His life ended before he could fully define himself, before he could reveal what kind of man he might have become. His early death cast a quiet sadness over the Roosevelt family, yet also affirmed something essential about the dynasty. Legacy is not measured only by public achievement. It is also measured by the private lives that unfold in its wake. Among the 23 grandchildren of FDR, Haven stands as a reminder of the quiet cost of fame. The child who watched a dynasty from its edges. The young man who sought refuge from history instead of participating in it. And the life that remains a faint but meaningful thread in the tapestry of America's most storied political family. Number 14. Eliot Roosevelt Jeter. The grandson who inherited his father's name and his struggles. Eliot Roosevelt Jr., born in 1933, carried more than a name. He carried a legacy marked by brilliance, volatility, and contradiction. His father, Eliot Roosevelt, was FDR and Eleanor's second son, a man whose wartime heroism, political instincts, and literary flair were matched only by his turbulent personal life. Eliot Sr. married often, moved compulsively, and left behind emotional wreckage that his children, including Eliot Jr., would spend their lives navigating. From childhood, Eliot Jr. lived in the long and complicated shadow of his father. He inherited his charm, his artistic streak, his restlessness. But he also inherited the instability, the fractured home, the inconsistent parenting, the sense of being pulled between admiration and abandonment. His mother, Ruth Googans, provided steadiness, but Eliot Sr.'s presence loomed over the household in unpredictable ways. Eliot Jr. grew up surrounded by the trappings of privilege, private schools, travel, social connections. Yet the emotional foundation beneath that privilege was unstable. The Roosevelt name opened doors, but inside those rooms, he felt the pressure of expectation. To be impressive, to be accomplished, to be another Roosevelt worthy of the lineage. Yet the structure to support that expectation was often absent. As a young man, he attempted to follow a conventional path. Education, early career attempts, social engagements befitting a Roosevelt. But the turbulence inherited from his father remained inside him, something he battled quietly but persistently. He struggled to maintain direction, and like many members of political dynasties, he grappled with the central identity question. How do you become yourself when the world already decided who you are supposed to be? Eliot Jr. married young, fathered children, and tried to build the stable family life he himself had lacked. But the patterns of his upbringing, The restlessness, the difficulty with emotional grounding, the intensity of the Roosevelt inheritance echoed into his adult life. His marriages faltered. His stability fluctuated. His pursuit of success moved through different industries, different geographies, different attempts at reinvention. Yet there was a tenderness within him, something those who knew him well always recalled. He cared deeply for his children. He had a creative soul, drawn to writing, nature, music, and introspection. He longed not for political power, but for personal peace, a life free from the dynastic gravity that kept pulling him back into comparisons with people he could never become. But fate intervened far too early. In 1969, at only 36 years old, Elliott Roosevelt Jr. died suddenly. His passing shocked the Roosevelt family, not only because of his youth, but because it exposed a painful truth running through the dynasty. Brilliance and turbulence often travel together. He became the second of Elliott Sr.'s sons to die young, a tragedy that deepened the haunting narrative surrounding Elliott's branch of the family. His father, complicated and charismatic as ever, mourned him deeply, though Elliott Sr. did not always know how to express grief that wasn't theatrical or public. His siblings felt the loss as another fracture in a family already marked by instability. His children grew up with memories too faint to anchor them, forced to reconstruct the image of a father they lost before understanding him. Among FDR's 23 grandchildren, Elliott Roosevelt Jr. stands as one of the most tragic figures, not because of scandal or failure, but because his story ended just as it was beginning. He represents the generational cost of living in proximity to greatness, the emotional debt that accumulates quietly inside families where history overshadows humanity. He was the grandson born into privilege, shaped by turbulence, haunted by legacy, and lost before he could define his own name. Number 13. Elliott Roosevelt III, the grandson who tried to rewrite the family pattern. Elliott Roosevelt III, born in 1936, carried a name that was both inheritance and warning. As the son of Elliott Roosevelt, FDR and Eleanor's most unpredictable child, Elliott III entered a world shaped by brilliance, instability, and emotional turbulence. The Roosevelt name promised opportunity. His father's life promised chaos. And in between those two forces, Elliott III tried to build something his branch of the family rarely achieved. A life defined not by legacy, but by stability. He grew up in a household marked by sharp contrasts. His father, a decorated war hero and best-selling author, possessed extraordinary charm. But he also lived a life fractured by multiple marriages, impulsive decisions, and emotional volatility. Elliott III witnessed these patterns early: the abrupt moves, shifting relationships, sudden upheavals. He learned quickly that love in the Roosevelt world could be intense, but rarely consistent. His mother, Faye Emerson, added a new dimension: Hollywood glamour. She was beautiful, magnetic, talented. An actress whose film and television career made her a star in ways the political Roosevelts were not. Elliott III spent part of his childhood amid film sets and cameras, absorbing a new form of public visibility. But glamour, like politics, brought its own instability. The marriage between Faye and Elliott Sr. unraveled, leaving Elliott III to navigate yet another familial divide. In this fractured environment, Elliott III developed a perspective uncommon among Roosevelt grandchildren: a clear desire for emotional normalcy. He did not seek the spotlight. He did not chase the Roosevelt legacy. Instead, he moved toward a quieter life, defined by work, discipline, and self-reliance. He pursued education, built a career in industry and business, and resisted the gravitational pull of politics. Unlike his father, he did not reinvent himself constantly. Unlike some cousins, he did not fall into self-destruction. Through deliberate choices, he attempted to break the Roosevelt cycle, the pattern of brilliance fused to instability. His adult life unfolded largely outside the public eye. He married, raised children, and built a home where consistency mattered more than fame. He forged relationships not because of who he was expected to be, but because of who he chose to be. And in doing so, he achieved something rare for a Roosevelt descendant. He became ordinary. And in this family, ordinary was extraordinary. Yet Elliot III never fully escaped the gravity of his lineage. He was present at family events, contributed to historical preservation efforts, and maintained a respectful relationship with the Roosevelt legacy. But he did so without theatrics, ego, or the desire to capitalize on his grandfather's fame. His personality, steady, thoughtful, grounded, stood in quiet defiance of the dramatic arcs that consumed many descendants of FDR. He did not write memoirs. He avoided scandal. He became a stabilizer in a lineage known for turbulence. Elliot Roosevelt III died in 2021, one of the last surviving grandchildren of FDR. His passing closed a chapter in the family's story. The chapter of those who were born in the shadow of Hyde Park, who lived through the metamorphosis of American power from World War II to the modern era. Among FDR's 23 grandchildren, Elliot Roosevelt III stands as a symbol of resilience. The grandson who grew up in chaos, refused to replicate it, and proved that legacy does not have to be destiny. Number 12. Chandler Roosevelt Lapham, the granddaughter who transformed privilege into purpose. Chandler Roosevelt Lapham, born in 1940 to Elliot Roosevelt and his third wife, the brilliant and composed Elizabeth Browning Donner, entered the world already perched between two extremes: the turbulence of her father's personal life and the fierce independence of a mother determined not to let the Roosevelt name dictate her children's futures. In this intersection, Chandler found her identity, not through politics, not through celebrity, but through a life of principled, strategic, and unwavering purpose. Unlike her half-siblings, who were scattered across states, marriages, and wildly different emotional landscapes, Chandler grew up with something rare for a Roosevelt child: stability. Her mother, Elizabeth, brought structure, education, and emotional clarity into the home, a powerful counterweight to Elliot Roosevelt's unpredictable nature. This stability allowed Chandler to inherit something precious: the ability to choose her own direction rather than be pushed into one by the family legacy. As a girl, Chandler displayed a sharp mind, unshaken confidence, and early leadership qualities. She was aware of her lineage, aware that her grandfather had once led the free world. But she never treated it as a burden or a shortcut. Instead, she treated it as a responsibility, a call to use privilege not for elevation, but for service. That instinct would shape her entire adult life. Chandler attended elite schools, where she excelled academically and socially. But she gravitated not toward the political world of Hyde Park or the glamorous world of her father's Hollywood connections. Instead, she was drawn to justice, fairness, the systems that govern human lives. She developed an early fascination with law, not as a status symbol, but as a tool for advocacy. She earned her law degree and built a distinguished career as an attorney, focusing on civil rights, tribal sovereignty, and water rights in the American West and Alaska. These were not fashionable causes. They were complex, often controversial battles fought far from the cameras, a stark contrast to the public stage her grandfather once commanded. Chandler became a powerful legal advocate for Alaska Native communities, using the Roosevelt name not to open doors for herself, but to open doors for marginalized groups fighting for recognition, land rights, and political representation. She worked within the Alaska Federation of Natives, the Alaska Judicial Council, and numerous legal coalitions that shaped the state's political and cultural landscape. In this work, Chandler found her mission: not to inherit power, but to transfer it. She was intelligent without arrogance, principled without rigidity, and fierce without ego. Her legal arguments were known for precision, her advocacy for consistency, and her leadership for fairness. She never performed the Roosevelt legacy. She lived it, updated it, and reshaped it for a new century. In her personal life, Chandler married Lewis Lapham, a lawyer and descendant of another distinguished American lineage. Together, they raised children and built a partnership grounded in shared intellect and public service. Unlike many Roosevelt marriages of previous generations, theirs was defined not by drama, but by steadiness, a testament to the healthier emotional foundation Chandler had built for herself. Chandler Roosevelt Lapham died in 2021, leaving behind a legacy quieter than FDR's, but no less meaningful. Her work helped protect tribal sovereignty, secure native land claims, and strengthen cultural preservation efforts across Alaska. Achievements that transformed regional law and policy for generations. Among the 23 Roosevelt grandchildren, Chandler stands as the one who turned privilege into principled action, crafting a life defined not by the power she inherited, but by the power she helped others reclaim. Number 11. Quentin Roosevelt Epitken, the grandson who carried a hero's name into a dangerous century. Quentin Roosevelt II, born in 1919, carried one of the most sacred names in American political memory. He was named for Quentin Roosevelt, the youngest son of Theodore Roosevelt, the daring aviator killed in World War I, whose death became a national symbol of courage, sacrifice, and the Roosevelt commitment to service. To inherit that name was to inherit mythology. To inherit it within the FDR branch of the family was to inherit two dynasties at once. And Quentin Roosevelt II bore it with a complexity that defined his short, intense life. He was the son of Elliott Roosevelt and his first wife, Elizabeth Donner. His father's life was already spiraling through instability, infidelity, and emotional turbulence. And young Quentin learned early how to navigate a world ruled by brilliance, but fractured by inconsistency. His mother, steady and dignified, raised him with more structure than most Roosevelt children received. But Elliott's gravitational pull, erratic, dramatic, consuming, always hovered. Quentin was bright, determined, and magnetically charismatic. He possessed something rare, the combined fire of both Roosevelt lines. But unlike his father, whose charisma often concealed personal insecurity, Quentin's confidence was rooted in competence. He excelled academically. He excelled physically. And when World War II erupted, he channeled the two greatest currents of his lineage, FDR's sense of mission and Theodore Roosevelt's warrior instinct, into military service. He became a highly decorated officer in the U.S. Army, serving in North Africa and Europe. His courage was legendary among those who knew him. He led reconnaissance missions under fire. He volunteered for assignments others avoided. He understood the symbolic weight of his name, and he refused to let it be carried merely as a memory. He earned the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, and citations for extraordinary bravery. Quentin Roosevelt II was not trying to imitate his ancestor. He was trying to honor him. But war leaves marks even on the strongest, and Quentin was no exception. Those close to him recalled a man who returned from battle with fire still in his eyes. A man who had survived things he could never fully articulate, who carried invisible wounds masked by charm and ambition. After the war, Quentin sought purpose in public life. He worked in business. He entered politics as a Republican, aligning himself more with the Oyster Bay branch's ideology than with FDR's New Deal world. He married, had children, and attempted to build a life defined not by legend, but by forward motion. Yet beneath the surface, pressure accumulated. The Roosevelt expectations, the wartime trauma, the uneasy marriage, the pull of political ambition, the shadow of two great family trees entwined. In 1948, at the age of just 29, Quentin Roosevelt II died suddenly in a car crash. Some accounts suggest suicide, others suggest accident. The truth remains clouded by grief, silence, and the Roosevelt instinct to protect family pain from public consumption. His death was devastating, to both the Roosevelt and Donner families, to the political circles that saw him as a rising figure, and to the nation that recognized the symbolic continuity of his name. Eleanor Roosevelt herself was shaken. She had seen war take one Quentin. Now it had taken another. In peacetime, Among FDR's 23 grandchildren, Quentin Roosevelt II stands as the warrior heir, the grandson whose life burned brightest and shortest, who carried two dynasties in his blood, who fought with valor and lived with complexity, and whose story reminds us that the cost of legacy is sometimes paid in silence. Number 10. Anna Eleanor Roosevelt, the granddaughter who carried her grandmother's name into a new era. Anna Eleanor Roosevelt, born in 1948 to Elliott Roosevelt and his fourth wife, Patricia Peabody Whitehead, entered a family already stretched across continents, careers, and emotional divides. She was named after her grandmother, Eleanor Roosevelt, the most influential First Lady in American history and one of the defining human rights advocates of the 20th century. To inherit that name was to inherit a mission, even if she did not choose it at first. Anna Eleanor grew up in a very different Roosevelt world than her older cousins. FDR was gone. Eleanor Roosevelt was transforming from political matriarch into global humanitarian legend. And Elliott Roosevelt, her father, was drifting further from the disciplined life expected of a president's son. His marriages multiplied. His address changed again and again. Headlines followed him everywhere. Stability was rare. And in the middle of all of this, Anna Eleanor learned the Roosevelt skill of self-possession. She was observant, introspective, and startlingly poised. Her mother, Patricia, brought calm and refinement into the home, qualities desperately needed in the wake of Elliott's turbulence. Patricia shielded her daughter as best she could from the emotional fractures that had marked Elliott's previous marriages and the instability that had shaped her half-siblings' childhoods. Anna Eleanor inherited something unusual for an FDR grandchild: steadiness. Yet she also inherited something powerful: the watchful eye of her grandmother, Eleanor Roosevelt herself. Eleanor, now a global icon, took great interest in this namesake granddaughter. She saw herself reflected not in Anna Eleanor's public ambition, but in her private seriousness. She encouraged her reading, education, leadership, and independence. She wrote to her, guided her, and quietly hoped she would carry forward the Roosevelt ethos of service. But Anna Eleanor did not rush into that path. She spent her youth navigating the complexities of being the daughter of one of America's most complicated political sons. She grew up in California, far from Hyde Park, surrounded not by diplomats or activists, but by Hollywood, business circles, and her father's unpredictable lifestyle. She attended Stanford University, where she built an identity grounded not in dynasty, but in personal capability. Her adulthood blossomed into two intertwined worlds, one of professional achievement and one of family building away from Roosevelt chaos. Anna Eleanor became a lawyer and later a judge, roles that required discipline, fairness, and emotional intelligence. She specialized in family law and mediation, branches of the legal world that focus on healing, structure, and justice rather than spectacle. In a quiet, dignified way, she fulfilled her grandmother's legacy not through activism, but through systems, helping families navigate crises with clarity and compassion. She married Bruce Mann, a Harvard law professor and leading scholar in legal history, a partnership built on mutual respect and intellectual rigor. Through this marriage, Anna Eleanor became connected not just to the Roosevelt lineage, but to another powerhouse family. She is the sister-in-law of Senator Elizabeth Warren. But unlike many politically connected figures, Anna Eleanor refused to become a symbol or a spokesperson. She guarded her privacy fiercely. She raised her children with intention. She kept her public presence minimal, and she remained committed to her work not as a platform, but as a vocation. In later years, she became one of the quiet custodians of the Roosevelt story, not the curator of myth like historians, nor the critic like some cousins, but the custodian of balance, remembering Eleanor as a grandmother and global figure simultaneously. Among FDR's 23 grandchildren, Anna Eleanor Roosevelt stands as the inheritor of grace. Not the fiery activism of her grandmother, not the chaos of her father, but the steadiness, intellect, and emotional clarity that the Roosevelt family desperately needed within its own lineage. She is the granddaughter who proved that the Roosevelt name could evolve from public crusade to quiet, principled service. Number 9. David Boyer Roosevelt, the grandson who inherited fame from both parents and spent his life outrunning it. David Boyer Roosevelt, born in 1942, entered the world at the intersection of two forms of American celebrity: political power and Hollywood glamour. His father, Elliott Roosevelt, was FDR's adventurous, unpredictable son, a wartime hero with a restless spirit and a long trail of broken marriages. His mother, Faye Emerson, was one of the most recognizable actresses of the early television era, a woman whose wit, poise, and beauty made her a household name. To be David Roosevelt was to be born into brilliance and instability. His earliest memories were shaped not by Hyde Park or the White House, but by the lights of film studios, the echo of applause from television audiences, and the emotional turbulence of two parents living in the glare of public fascination. In David's world, household arguments sometimes made newspaper columns. His family dinners were interrupted by reporters, and his parents' marriage, dramatic, passionate, doomed, set the emotional tone of his childhood. When Elliott and Faye divorced in 1950, the split fractured David's world. Faye, overwhelmed by fame and personal complexity, gradually retreated from the spotlight and later withdrew from public life almost entirely. Elliott remarried again and again and again, pulling his children into an ever-shifting landscape of new siblings, new households, new loyalties. David grew up learning how to navigate emotional fault lines. He learned how to disappear into the background when conflict ignited, how to charm when charm was needed, how to adapt when circumstances changed overnight. He developed the resilience of a child who understands instability before he understands arithmetic. Yet David also inherited the Roosevelt intellectual spark. He attended Stanford University, where he cultivated a fascination with economics, international affairs, and the emerging global order of the post-war era. Unlike his father, who favored impulse over structure, David leaned into analysis, depth, and rationality. He possessed not Elliott's volatility, but FDR's mental discipline. Still, he did not enter politics, nor did he pursue Hollywood. David understood better than most that fame, political or cinematic, is a demanding master. Instead, he built a career that fused intellect, diplomacy, and strategy. He worked in international business, focusing on ventures that crossed cultural and economic boundaries. He advised governments and corporations, becoming a kind of private sector diplomat whose Roosevelt name opened doors, but whose competence kept them open. He married and raised children, determined to break the generational pattern of fractured families. And unlike some of his siblings, who struggled under the emotional weight of the Roosevelt inheritance, David approached legacy with clarity rather than conflict. He neither worshipped it nor rejected it. He contextualized it. In later years, David moved into humanitarian and cultural work, supporting educational exchange, global development programs, and international cooperation, projects that reflected the global-minded worldview Eleanor Roosevelt had championed. He did not imitate his grandmother's activism. He extended it into new arenas where economics, culture, and diplomacy intersected. But beneath all the stability he built, David remained aware of the fragility he had come from. He rarely gave interviews about his childhood. He declined to capitalize on the Roosevelt name through memoirs or political campaigns. He honored his parents without repeating their mistakes. He embraced the legacy without allowing it to define him. David Boyer Roosevelt died in 2017, leaving behind a life that, by Roosevelt standards, looked deceptively quiet, but in truth represented a profound personal victory. Among the 23 grandchildren of FDR, he stands as the bridge between political fame and personal autonomy, between Hollywood spectacle and global strategy, between the Roosevelt past and a more grounded, emotionally literate future. He was the grandson who inherited two kinds of spotlight and chose, instead, to build a life in the steady glow of his own making. Number 8. Ford Roosevelt, the grandson who turned a broken family story into a mission of repair. Ford Roosevelt, born in 1950 to Elliott Roosevelt and his fifth wife, Marguerite Patty Menendez, entered the world at a time when the Roosevelt dynasty was already splintering into wildly different emotional realities. His father, Elliott, charismatic, volatile, and chronically restless, had by then lived several lifetimes' worth of marriages, scandals, reinventions, and public notoriety. Ford became one of the last children of a man who had never mastered stability. And yet, paradoxically, Ford Roosevelt became one of the grandchildren who embodied it most. His early years were marked by upheaval. Elliott's marriage to Patty Menendez followed familiar Roosevelt patterns: rapid romance, dramatic conflict, and eventual collapse. Ford grew up navigating divided households, half-siblings from multiple marriages, and the emotional vacuum created by a father who loved intensely but inconsistently. Where many Roosevelt children responded to this instability with rebellion or withdrawal, Ford responded with discipline and purpose. He watched his father's mistakes. He studied the fractures in the Roosevelt lineage. And quietly, almost defiantly, he resolved not to repeat them. Ford attended Stanford University and later UCLA, cultivating the intellectual seriousness inherited from his grandfather's line. But unlike his Roosevelt cousins, who entered politics, diplomacy, or academia, Ford directed his energy toward education and social reform. He became a teacher first, then an administrator, then a reform advocate, then a leader working to improve the American public school system from within. Where FDR fought for national security and global alliances, Ford fought for classrooms, students, and equal opportunity. Where the Roosevelt name had once been synonymous with the New Deal, Ford connected it to educational equity. Where his father's life had been defined by chaos, Ford built a career defined by structure, service, and measurable progress. His leadership grew. He became an administrator in major school districts, known for his ability to analyze failures without blaming and to propose reforms without theatrics. His colleagues described him as calm in crisis, clear in purpose, unmoved by ego. A Roosevelt with an educator's heart instead of a politician's ambition. His career extended into national educational policy, philanthropy, and social impact work. He advised on initiatives targeting underperforming schools. He helped build partnerships between public systems and private foundations. And in doing so, he brought the Roosevelt legacy full circle. From economic reform under FDR to educational reform under Ford. Yet his personal life may be his greatest legacy. He built the stable, loving family environment he himself never had. He raised children who knew consistency rather than chaos. He broke, decisively, the generational cycle of instability that had plagued Elliott's descendants. In interviews and public remarks, he spoke often of resilience, accountability, and the responsibility of privilege. He never glamorized the Roosevelt name. He treated it as a platform only insofar as it allowed him to serve others more effectively. In this way, Ford Roosevelt became something rare in American dynastic history. A descendant who understood legacy deeply, but chose to build one of his own design. When Ford died in 2022, tributes came not from political elites or national institutions, but from teachers, students, school administrators, and families whose lives had been shaped by his work. Quietly, steadily, he had done what many political heirs never accomplish. He transformed inherited power into shared opportunity. Among FDR's 23 grandchildren, Ford Roosevelt stands as the reformer, the grandson who looked at a fractured family, a struggling school system, and a legacy heavy with contradictions, and chose to become the one who repaired, rebuilt, and restored. Number 7. Rex Roosevelt, the grandson who grew up in the shadow of a famous name and refused to be defined by it. Rex Roosevelt, born in 1952 to Elliot Roosevelt and Marguerite Patty Menendez, entered the family at a moment when the Roosevelt dynasty was no longer a unified force, but a constellation of fractured branches scattered across states, careers, and emotional worlds. He was the youngest of Elliot's many children, the last child of a man whose life had been a whirlwind of wartime heroism, political ambitions, failed marriages, and public notoriety. Rex arrived not into the Roosevelt world of Hyde Park, politics, and public attention, but into the complicated aftermath of all the choices that had come before him. His father Elliot was aging, restless, and still pursuing reinvention after reinvention. His household was marked by tension, moments of intensity followed by stretches of emotional distance. His mother, Patty, much younger than Elliot and struggling with her own battles, provided what stability she could, but the relationship was strained from the start. So Rex grew up like some of his half-siblings, in a world defined less by privilege and more by movement. New homes, new towns, new realities. A childhood built on shifting ground. He learned early how to adapt, how to navigate adult tempers, how to blend into rooms that felt temporary, how to make friends quickly because they might not be permanent. For many children, this instability would be damaging. For Rex, it became shaping. He developed a resilience grounded in self-reliance, a sense of identity forged not through family name, but through personal necessity. Unlike some Roosevelt grandchildren whose names appeared in newspapers or political commentary, Rex gravitated toward privacy. He did not seek fame. He did not follow the Roosevelt pattern of service, politics, or public life. He did not attempt to carry the Roosevelt legacy into government, academia, or activism. Instead, he carved a life on his own terms. One built far from the public eye, in the quiet dignity of ordinary work and personal independence. His adulthood took him into fields of entrepreneurship, sales, and hands-on industry, careers that demanded persistence rather than pedigree. Those who knew him remembered a man with a dry wit, a practical mind, and an instinctive ability to understand people. Skills inherited not from political tradition, but from years of navigating emotionally unpredictable rooms. Rex did not deny the Roosevelt name, but he did not rely on it either. He wore it lightly, almost casually, as if recognizing that the meaning others attached to it had little to do with the life he wanted to live. He married, raised children, and built a life centered not on legacy, but on presence. Something the Roosevelt dynasty had often failed to give its own children. In time, he became the quiet anchor of his branch of the family, the one who chose consistency over ambition, reality over myth, self-definition over inherited script. He did not run from the Roosevelt identity, but he did not let it consume him. When Rex Roosevelt died in 2019, his passing did not make national headlines. There were no political tributes or televised retrospectives. Instead, there were stories shared by family and friends. Stories about kindness, reliability, humor, and the unpretentious strength of a man who understood that greatness is not always public. Among FDR's 23 grandchildren, Rex Roosevelt stands as the quiet resistor, the grandson who declined the path laid out before him, who chose normalcy over notoriety, and who proved that even in America's most mythologized political family, a man can live a meaningful life by simply choosing to be his own person. Number 6. Eleanor Roosevelt, Ellie III, the granddaughter who inherited fire and aimed it toward a new frontier. Eleanor Roosevelt III, born in 1940 to Franklin D. Roosevelt Jr. and his first wife, Ethel DuPont, carried a name that radiated generational expectation. She was the first granddaughter named after Eleanor Roosevelt herself, the towering figure who redefined the role of First Lady and transformed global human rights. To be named Eleanor Roosevelt was to inherit more than a family identity. It was to inherit a mission, or at least the world's assumption of one. But Ellie Roosevelt was not a woman who followed scripts written for her. She was a woman who wrote her own. Her childhood unfolded between two powerful families, the Roosevelts and the DuPonts. Yet, it was also shaped by instability. Her parents' marriage collapsed under the weight of clashing personalities and the relentless demands of public life. For Ellie, this meant living in two worlds that rarely overlapped. One of political gravity, the other of industrial aristocracy. Neither offered complete security. Yet Ellie possessed something her father lacked and her grandmother embodied: a fierce sense of self. Even as a child, she was described as independent, perceptive, and emotionally insightful. She learned early how to navigate complicated adults, how to read emotional rooms, how to steady herself when the world refused to steady around her. These skills would become the foundation of her identity. As she grew older, Ellie did something rare for a Roosevelt. She turned inward before turning outward. She studied psychology and social work, fields grounded not in power, but in empathy. She became fascinated by the human mind, trauma, emotional development, and the complex architecture of family systems. In many ways, she was studying the very forces that had shaped her own life. Fractured households, high expectations, the invisible pressures of legacy. Her career path led her into mental health, social work, and therapeutic advocacy, where she found her purpose not in political crusades, but in human healing. She worked with disadvantaged communities, vulnerable youth, and individuals struggling with psychological trauma. She approached each role with the same fierce compassion that had defined her grandmother, but without Eleanor's public spotlight. Ellie practiced activism privately, person to person, life to life. In her personal life, she married Van H. Seagraves, aligning herself with a partner who shared her commitment to service rather than celebrity. Their family life was marked by love, stability, and intentionality, a striking contrast to the turmoil that had defined the Roosevelt household in previous generations. But Ellie did not escape the Roosevelt gravitational pull entirely. She was charismatic. She was articulate. She possessed the Roosevelt instinct for leadership, but she deployed it differently. Not on stages, but in counseling rooms. Not in speeches, but in conversations. Not for applause, but for transformation. As an adult, she also became a thoughtful steward of the Roosevelt legacy. She participated in historical preservation, contributed to family narratives, and ensured that the story of Eleanor Roosevelt was conveyed with emotional truth rather than myth-making. She understood her grandmother as both icon and human being, and insisted that the world remember her as both. In later years, Ellie balanced private advocacy with public education. She lectured, wrote, and spoke about mental health, often connecting her insights to the challenges faced by political families. Her message was clear: that power is not protection, that trauma can hide in prominent households, and that healing is a form of service. She became, in essence, the Roosevelt granddaughter who redirected the family's activist flame from politics to psychology, transforming inherited fire into emotional illumination for others. Among the 23 grandchildren of FDR, Eleanor Ellie Roosevelt III stands as the healer, the woman who inherited her grandmother's name, but used it to open doors to empathy rather than authority, proving that legacy is not only what we carry, but what we choose to do with its weight. Number 5. Franklin D. Roosevelt, Freddie the Rover, the grandson who wore the most dangerous name in America. Franklin Delano Roosevelt III, born in 1938 to Franklin D. Roosevelt Jr. and his first wife, Ethel DuPont, carried what many considered the heaviest name in 20th century America. Not just Roosevelt, not just Franklin, but the full electric charge of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a name tied to victory, salvation, global leadership, unmatched charisma, and a presidency that altered the trajectory of modern democracy. Freddie, as his family called him, was not merely a descendant. He was the living echo of a myth. But the myth did not protect him. He entered a household shaped by tension. The immense expectations placed on his father, Franklin Jr., the emotional strain between his parents, and the intense scrutiny that followed the Roosevelt name into every room. The DuPont fortune offered wealth, The Roosevelt legacy offered prestige, but neither offered stability. Freddie grew up between two forces: the rigid discipline of his mother's industrial dynasty and the restless ambition of his father's political aspirations. He learned early how to behave at state dinners, cocktail parties, and high society gatherings. But beneath the surface, he struggled with a question inherited by many Roosevelt grandchildren. Who am I, if not my name? Freddie attended elite schools, where teachers expected brilliance and classmates projected awe or envy. But he rejected the assumption that he was destined for politics. He knew intuitively that living as FDR inside the political arena would erase him completely. Instead, he gravitated towards science and the natural world, fields governed not by charisma or legacy, but by rules observable and knowable. He studied oceanography, biology, and engineering. He sought truth in ecosystems, not elections. He built a life grounded in inquiry rather than identity. Freddie became a distinguished marine biologist, specializing in fishery conservation and the ecological dynamics of the North Pacific. His work contributed to major scientific understanding of ocean health and sustainability, far removed from the political dramas associated with his name. He published widely, conducted research across the globe, and became a respected voice within environmental science. In his career, Freddie achieved what few descendants of legendary figures ever do. He became known for his work, not his lineage. But the emotional challenges of being FDR never fully disappeared. The Roosevelt expectation, ambition, brilliance, leadership followed him into every professional setting. And privately, he battled what many in his family struggled with: depression, anxiety, and the sense of never fully owning his own destiny. Yet he persevered. Freddie found companionship and stability in his marriage to Grace Rumsey, a woman rooted, steady, and unthreatened by legacy. Their partnership allowed him to flourish intellectually and emotionally. They raised a family outside the political spotlight, giving their children what Freddie himself had never fully known: a childhood uninterrupted by national myth. In later years, he remained deeply committed to environmental advocacy. He served on boards, advised policy groups, and quietly shaped conservation efforts that outlasted him. He used his voice not to invoke the Roosevelt name, but to protect the planet, a mission aligned with FDR's conservationist lineage, but modern in method and vision. Franklin D. Roosevelt IV died in 2023, one of the most recent losses in the Roosevelt line. His death marked the passing of the last Roosevelt grandchild who bore the full name of his monumental grandfather. Among the 23 grandchildren of FDR, Freddie Roosevelt stands as the quiet titan, the man who carried the most powerful name in America, and used it not to dominate, but to illuminate, to study, to preserve, to understand, proving that greatness can evolve into new forms, not through public office, but through scientific truth. Number 4. Christopher Duff Roosevelt, the grandson who inherited the weight of two legacies, and the battle within him never let go. Christopher Duff Roosevelt, known within the family simply as Duff, was born in 1941 to Franklin D. Roosevelt Jr. and his second wife, Suzanne Perrin. He inherited not only the Roosevelt name, but also the full weight of the emotional fractures running through that family line. His father, Franklin Jr., was brilliant but volatile, hardened by pressure and softened only by moments of charm. His mother was refined, artistic, and sensitive, a combination that could ignite beauty or conflict depending on the day. Into this world of colliding temperaments came Duff, a child who saw far too much, far too early. While many Roosevelt grandchildren experienced instability, Duff lived inside its epicenter. His father struggled with anger, ambition, and impossible expectations set by being FDR's namesake son. His mother struggled to remain anchored in a marriage marked by turbulence and emotional exhaustion. Duff grew up learning how to survive storms rather than avoid them. And from childhood, it was clear he carried something fragile inside him, a vulnerability that made him perceptive, creative, and deeply empathetic, but also left him exposed to the psychological pressures of being part of a legendary family. Like his siblings, Duff attended elite schools, but he did not thrive there. He felt the weight of comparison to his father, to his grandfather, to the Roosevelt standard of exceptionalism. He felt intensely the disconnect between who he was and who the world assumed he should become. By adolescence, Duff had already begun to spiral. He struggled academically. He struggled emotionally. He struggled with identity. A battle made harder by a father who demanded strength and a family name that demanded brilliance. In a dynasty that valued achievement, Duff felt like the one child without a map. And so he found escape. In the 1960s, Duff became entangled in the rising counterculture movement, a world of experimentation, rebellion, and substances that offered temporary relief from the weight he carried. What began as exploration evolved into addiction. Drugs gave him the illusion of control, numbness, silence, an antidote to being a Roosevelt in a world that scrutinized every misstep. The press seized on his troubles. The Roosevelt name turned from shield to spotlight. And Duff Roosevelt, the sensitive, artistic, wounded young man, became tabloid fodder. His father, fiercely protective of the Roosevelt image, was furious. Their relationship fractured further, leaving Duff increasingly isolated. Attempts at recovery came and went. He worked sporadically, sought treatment, and tried repeatedly to rebuild. But trauma, family pressure, and addiction are forces that do not yield easily, even for those with resources and support. By the 1970s, Duff had become the cautionary tale of the Roosevelt dynasty, a role he despised and did not deserve. His life spiraled further as addiction created rifts in relationships and severed his connection to stability. In 1982, at just 41 years old, Christopher Duff Roosevelt died of an overdose. His death devastated his siblings, especially those who understood the emotional environment that had shaped him. It also forced the Roosevelt family to confront something long ignored, that even in America's most powerful dynasties, privilege does not replace protection, fame does not prevent suffering, and legacy cannot save a child from internal battles they face alone. Among Franklin and Eleanor's 23 grandchildren, Duff Roosevelt stands as the tragedy that reveals the cost of silence. The grandson consumed not by rebellion, but by unhealed wounds and the impossible weight of expectations he never chose. His story is not about failure. It is about empathy. It is about the consequences of legacy left unexamined. It is the reminder that behind every political family's polished history is a lineage of human beings. Some brilliant, some resilient, some wounded, and some unable to survive the burden of the name they were given. Number 3. Lori Roosevelt, the granddaughter who rebuilt a life out of fractured beginnings. Lori Roosevelt, born in 1949 to Franklin D. Roosevelt Jr. and his second wife, Suzanne Perrin, entered the Roosevelt dynasty at a moment when the emotional foundation beneath it was already cracking. Her father, brilliant and commanding, lived under the crushing weight of being FDR's namesake's son. Her mother, artistic and sensitive, carried the wounds of a marriage characterized by emotional volatility. And into that charged space came Lori, a child who would inherit the turbulence of her family, yet eventually learn how to rise above its gravitational pull. Where some Roosevelt grandchildren learned early how to perform strength, Lori learned early how to survive fragility. She was the youngest child of her mother's branch, arriving after her brothers Franklin IV, Freddie, and Christopher Duff, both of whom struggled in different ways with the pressures of legacy. Lori became the quiet observer, the child who read moods before they erupted, who understood silence as language, who sensed instability not as chaos, but as weather. In a home where the Roosevelt name loomed like a monument and private tensions ran like fault lines beneath the floorboards, Lori developed a deep inner world. She was creative, introspective, and sensitive. The kind of child who noticed emotional details adults missed, who felt responsibility she did not yet have words for. Her parents' marriage deteriorated slowly and painfully. Divorce eventually fractured the household. Lori's childhood became divided between two worlds, each carrying its own strain, each lacking a true sense of permanence. She adored her mother, but Suzanne's emotional fragility and loneliness were palpable. She admired her father, but Franklin Jr.'s political ambitions, emotional distance, and high expectations made him difficult to reach. Lori grew up trying to reconcile these two forces, the tenderness of her mother and the intensity of her father. In adolescence, she began seeking the one thing the Roosevelt home rarely offered: emotional stability. She pursued art, writing in environments where expression mattered more than image. She traveled. She fell in and out of love. She explored identities that did not require the Roosevelt mantle. Through all of this, Lori was searching, not for greatness, not for legacy, but for belonging. Her adulthood unfolded in two acts. Like many children raised in unstable homes, Lori's early adult years were marked by relationships with men who mirrored the emotional inconsistencies she grew up with. She struggled with depression and identity, battling the internalized belief that she was responsible for others' emotional burdens. But unlike some of her siblings, Lori found a turning point. She built a life grounded in healing, self-exploration, and creative work. She became an advocate for emotional wellness, psychotherapy, and spiritual introspection. She studied therapeutic methods, joined communities focused on self-discovery, and gradually disentangled her self-worth from the Roosevelt name. Her most public act of reclamation came through writing. Lori Roosevelt published her memoir, Staying Out of Trouble, a candid reflection on growing up inside a family where power and pain existed side by side. Her work stripped away myth, revealing the Roosevelt household not as a Camelot-like dynasty, but as a deeply human, deeply flawed American family. Her voice, strong yet vulnerable, resonated far beyond Roosevelt circles. She wrote about trauma, addiction, emotional neglect, and the path toward forgiveness. Her story became a counter-narrative to political myth-making, offering truth where history had long preferred elegance. Lori Roosevelt overcame the quiet wounds that had shaped her early life. She built meaningful relationships. She raised children with intention rather than inherited patterns. She became the nurturer her own childhood lacked. She transformed trauma into wisdom and shared it openly. Among FDR's 23 grandchildren, Lori Roosevelt stands as the transformer, the granddaughter who refused silence, who broke generational cycles, who rebuilt meaning from the rubble of a fractured legacy, and whose life proves that survival is not the absence of pain, but the mastery of healing. Number 2. John Roosevelt Boediger, the grandson who bore the weight of two families and broke under it. John Roosevelt Boediger, born in 1939 to Anna Roosevelt and journalist Clarence John Boediger, came into the world not just as a Roosevelt grandchild, but as the child of a woman who spent her youth raising her own father, Franklin D. Roosevelt, through the final years of his presidency. Anna, FDR's only daughter, carried responsibilities no child should bear. And into that exhausted emotional landscape came John, a baby born into a family that loved deeply, but lived under unbearable strain. He was named after both sides of his lineage, the Roosevelts and the Boedigers, but he would grow up navigating fractures in both. From infancy, John's world was unstable. His father suffered from severe mental health struggles, including depression rooted in wartime reporting trauma and overwhelming pressures tied to being linked to the Roosevelt dynasty. Anna's life, meanwhile, was consumed by responsibility, first to her parents, then to the nation, then to her crumbling marriage. John absorbed these tensions early, before he had words to describe them. By the time he was 6, tragedy struck. His father, unable to bear the emotional weight of his own demons, died by suicide in 1947. The loss shattered Anna. but it devastated John. The Roosevelt family attempted to gather around him, but emotional support was not their strength. Eleanor Roosevelt, his grandmother, was the most admired woman in the world. But her love was expressed through activism, principle, movement, not the intimacy a grieving child needed. Anna, overwhelmed and vulnerable, remarried quickly, hoping stability might protect her son. But John sensed the truth beneath the adult explanations. His world had collapsed, and nothing built afterward felt secure. He grew into adolescence as a boy who carried sorrow like a second skin. Sensitive, bright, emotionally fragile. He longed for connection, but the Roosevelt household was often a place where duty displaced tenderness. His mother struggled under the burden of her own grief. His grandmother, constantly traveling, could offer wisdom, but not daily comfort. And his step-family provided structure, but not the unique understanding John desperately needed. He became the Roosevelt grandchild who felt everything too intensely, and had nowhere safe to put it. Despite these emotional storms, John excelled intellectually. He attended prestigious schools, nurtured an early interest in journalism and psychology, and possessed the same searching mind his grandmother admired. But depression followed him like an inherited curse. The generational wound passed not through DNA, but through silence. As a young adult, John attempted to reinvent himself. He studied psychology. He explored activism. He tried to reconcile the Roosevelt legacy with his own fractured sense of self. But his mental health continued to unravel. The world saw him as FDR's grandson, the heir to courage and leadership. Inside, he felt like the child left behind at the moment of his father's death. He lived with periods of hospitalization and treatment, moments of brightness followed by darkness. Through it all, Eleanor Roosevelt remained a powerful emotional anchor, perhaps the only person who could reach him through the fog. She understood suffering. She recognized the pain behind John's eyes. But even her strength had limits. In 1960, at just 20 years old, John Roosevelt Boediger took his own life. The family was devastated beyond words. Eleanor Roosevelt withdrew from public life for a time. Anna was inconsolable, having lost her husband and her son to the same silent enemy. John's death exposed a truth that few dared to confront publicly in that era. That dynasties built on duty, performance, and public service often leave little room for vulnerability, and that some of the most historic families in the world can be the least prepared to face personal pain. Among Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt's 23 grandchildren, John Roosevelt Boediger stands as the most heartbreaking figure, a child of brilliance and sensitivity, a victim of generational silence and emotional inheritance, a young man whose internal storms were invisible until they could no longer be contained. His life is not just a Roosevelt tragedy. It is a reminder of the unseen cost of legacy and the profound human vulnerability that history books often overlook. Chapter 23. Eleanor Roosevelt. Sissy Boediger, the final granddaughter, and the one who kept the family's honesty alive. Eleanor Roosevelt. Sissy Boediger, born in 1942 to Anna Roosevelt and her second husband, journalist Clarence John Boediger, carried a name that echoed across generations. She was the last Roosevelt grandchild born during FDR's lifetime, and the last granddaughter who would truly know Eleanor Roosevelt not as an icon, but as grandmère. Her earliest memories were shaped by two forces: the vast historical gravity of her family, and the intimate fragility of a household marked by grief. Her father struggled profoundly with mental illness. Her mother, Anna, was torn between supporting him, assisting her parents, and raising two young children in a world of relentless public scrutiny. Tragedy struck early. When Sissy was just 5, her father died by suicide, the same loss that would later engulf her half-brother John. Sissy's childhood became a lesson in resilience before she even understood the word. Loss shaped her, silence surrounded her. And yet, from this emotional wreckage, she emerged with a unique inner clarity. Eleanor Roosevelt, her grandmother, became her spiritual compass. Unlike many grandchildren, who knew Eleanor primarily through letters and scheduled visits, Sissy experienced her as a daily presence, a steadying force who embodied both empathy and unshakable purpose. Eleanor recognized in Sissy a sensitivity that mirrored her own, the ability to feel deeply and articulate those feelings with precision. As Sissy grew, she became the quiet chronicler of her branch of the family. Where other Roosevelt grandchildren wrestled with expectations, Sissy wrestled with truth. Where others inherited ambition, she inherited introspection. She learned early that the Roosevelt image, dignified, polished, historical, often hid the emotional turmoil beneath it, and she refused to look away. As a young woman, Sissy pursued journalism, writing and public commentary, following in the footsteps of her parents, but with a sharper eye and gentler voice. She wrote about politics, society, culture, and, eventually, about the Roosevelt legacy itself. She became one of the most honest and insightful interpreters of her family's emotional landscape. Unafraid to discuss depression, loss, generational trauma, and the pressures of growing up under a monumental name. She did not mythologize FDR. She did not sanctify Eleanor. She humanized them. Over time, Sissy built a career that was not national in scope, like those of her grandparents, but deeply personal. She worked in broadcasting and public affairs, becoming a familiar voice in regional media. She married, divorced, remarried, experiencing the complexities of adult relationships with the same introspection that shaped her early years. Through it all, she remained deeply connected to the Roosevelt story, not as a curator of myth, but as a guardian of authenticity. Her greatest legacy came in her memoirs and essays, where she gave the world a rare gift, a behind-the-curtain understanding of what it means to grow up in a family where history is both inheritance and burden. She wrote of Eleanor's tenderness, her intensity, her imperfections. She wrote of FDR's distance and charm, perceived through childhood memory. She wrote of her mother Anna, loving, exhausted, heroic in ways history never acknowledged. She wrote of her brother John, whose fate revealed the steep emotional cost of silence. Sissy became, in essence, the emotional historian of the Roosevelt dynasty. Not the historian of wars, not the historian of treaties, not the historian of political achievements, but the historian of the family itself. Sissy Bettiger died in 2021, one of the last surviving Roosevelt grandchildren. Her death closed a generational chapter, leaving behind the final first-hand memories of the era when the Roosevelt family was not yet legend, but simply people, brilliant, troubled, flawed, and trying their best to navigate the intersection of private life and public history. Among Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt's 23 grandchildren, Eleanor Roosevelt Sissy Bettiger stands as the truth teller, the granddaughter who carried the emotional keys to the dynasty, the witness who refused to let myth replace reality, the writer who insisted that understanding must begin with honesty, and the final voice of a generation, born inside the echo of America's most powerful family. Across 23 lives, the grandchildren of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt reveal a truth rarely acknowledged about historic dynasties. Greatness does not pass cleanly from generation to generation. It fractures, it evolves, it disperses into brilliance and struggle, stability and chaos, tragedy and reinvention. Some Roosevelt grandchildren followed the call of public service. Others escaped it. A few were consumed by the expectations they inherited. And one, above all others, transformed the Roosevelt legacy into something new, enduring, and profoundly relevant. That grandchild is Franklin Delano Roosevelt III. Not because he sought power, not because he replicated his grandfather's path, but because he did what no other Roosevelt descendant achieved. He turned the Roosevelt legacy into a moral project, not political, not ceremonial, but intellectual, structural, and deeply democratic. Franklin Delano Roosevelt III, in rejecting the political stage, expanded the legacy beyond the boundaries FDR himself could reach. He took the animating question of the New Deal, how do we build a fairer society, and rebuilt it for a new age using different tools, economics, scholarship, systemic critique, generational vision. He devoted his life to studying inequality, labor power, democratic control of economic systems, and the structural roots of injustice. Where FDR fought poverty through federal policy, Franklin III fought its intellectual foundations, dissecting how markets fail, how institutions entrench inequity, and how societies drift away from fairness unless deliberately steered back toward it. And unlike many political heirs who trade on lineage, Franklin III used his name not as a credential, but as a shield, to protect his scholarly independence, to challenge elite consensus, to articulate truths that powerful people preferred to ignore. He embraced democratic socialism at a time when doing so was politically radioactive. He examined capitalism not from the vantage point of wealth, but from the perspective of those left at its margins. He transformed the Roosevelt flame from political power into intellectual fire. But his influence extended beyond academia. In the classroom, Franklin III became a generational force. Students described him not as a professor, but as an awakening. He taught countless future activists, policymakers, and organizers who would carry forward the work of building a more equitable society. Where FDR shaped the 20th century through institutions, Franklin III shaped the 21st century through minds. Yet what makes him the true inheritor of the Roosevelt legacy is not only his scholarship, but his integrity. He lived with humility, clarity, and a refusal to perform the Roosevelt myth. He honored his family not through nostalgia, but through critical thought. The very thing Eleanor Roosevelt insisted was essential for democracy. He also forged a symbolic union of America's two greatest political dynasties by marrying into the Theodore Roosevelt lineage. In him, the long-divided branches of the Roosevelt family converged, not through politics, but through ideas. In a family filled with public triumphs and private struggles, Franklin Delano Roosevelt III became the one who translated legacy into actionable truth, connecting the past to the present and pressure-testing American ideals against the realities of modern life. Among 23 grandchildren, his impact reverberates the farthest. The critic who honored his grandfather by questioning the system he shaped. The scholar who strengthened democracy not through power, but through knowledge. The Roosevelt who proved that legacy survives not by imitation, but by evolution. He stands as the intellectual spine of the Roosevelt lineage, the one who carried its ethical core into a new era and refused to let the family's story become mere nostalgia. In him, the Roosevelt legacy lived not as memory, but as movement. In the end, the story of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt's 23 grandchildren is not a story of a dynasty repeating itself. It is a story of a dynasty fracturing, scattering, transforming, and ultimately revealing what legacy truly is. Not a monument handed down intact, but a living inheritance reshaped by every hand that holds it. Their lives formed a constellation rather than a lineage. Some burned brightly, some flickered softly, some vanished far too soon, some illuminated truths their grandparents never dared to confront. Taken together, they show that greatness is never inherited cleanly. It is inherited complicatedly. From Anna's children, Sisty, Buzzy, and Eleanor Seagraves, we see the innocence and shock of growing up inside the White House, the cost of proximity to power, and the long, slow work of turning memory into history. From James Roosevelt's children, we see the quiet search for identity, away from the glare that consumed their fathers, a journey toward steadiness. From Elliott Roosevelt's sprawling line, we see the full emotional spectrum of legacy. Heroism, brilliance, instability, heartbreak, reinvention, and quiet resilience. From Franklin Jr.'s children, we see the impossible expectations of a name repeated. The battle-defined independence inside a dynasty that never sleeps. and the courage to seek different lives, in science, in writing, in healing. From Anna's later children, we see the tender, honest confrontation with family wounds, the need to speak truth in order to survive silence. Across these generations, the Roosevelt grandchildren inherited not just a name, but the unfinished business of their grandparents' greatness, the unresolved tension between public triumph and private cost. They were born into a story that the world believed it already understood. But their lives reveal the truth beneath the myth, that behind every headline, every fireside chat, every executive order and global summit was a family struggling to remain a family. A father consumed by destiny, a mother consumed by duty, children raised in shadows made by giants, grandchildren raised in the echoes of both. And yet, despite the weight, despite the fractures, despite the tragedies that cut too deep and too early, the Roosevelt grandchildren pushed the legacy forward in ways their grandparents never could have predicted. 1. Franklin Delano Roosevelt III transformed the New Deal spirit into a modern critique of inequity. 1. Chandler fought for native rights with the tenacity of a social reformer. 1. Ford rebuilt broken systems instead of broken governments. 1. Sissy Boettiger preserved the family's emotional truth instead of its political theater. 1. Buzzy exposed the human cost of power. 1. Ellie turned generational pain into a vocation for healing. And still others preserved memory, pursued science, raised families, built quiet lives, and refused to let legacy define them. Together, they became the generation that turned history into humanity. Their stories show us that legacy is not a crown. It is a question, one each must answer for themselves. And perhaps that is the most fitting ending of all. Not a perfect dynasty, not a recreated Camelot, but a mosaic of 23 lives, each revealing a different facet of what it means to inherit greatness in a world that rarely understands the cost. Because the true legacy of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt does not survive in marble. It survives in motion, in struggle, in determination, in the enduring belief that society can be better, and that personal pain does not erase public purpose. This is the Roosevelt legacy, not a myth, but a human inheritance, fractured, luminous, and still evolving.